Welcome to the Veganuary podcast, the podcast that helps you to try a vegan diet. It's stuffed full of hints and tips for vegans and veg-curious people. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Stu. Good to be here.
It's a challenge to read that intro like in a cool, funky new way every time, but I enjoy it. I'm going to ask you, as I always do, Wendy, the most vegan thing that's happened to you this week.
I have a good one from this morning. I ran out of coffee creamer at home, so I put some almonds and dates and vanilla in my Vitamix and just whipped up a little homemade creamer at 7:30 in the morning. And I was like, that might be level 10 vegan to make my own plant-based creamer.
Well done. Is that a recipe that you knew, or were you just making it up?
Kind of just making it up. Probably one of those things where I've looked up a recipe years ago and then just sort of memorized it by now.
Coffee creamer isn't something we really have in the UK.
Oh, it's a big deal here.
Yeah. But why is it different to milk?
It's just a little bit richer and creamier.
Okay.
A lot of them are sweetened or flavored. Yeah, I would say a lot of people, when they first go vegan, that's their biggest gripe. They say they can't get their coffee the color they want it, or they can't find a creamer that they love. So
interesting. You in the US, do you have like plant milks and then Barista plant milks?
We do. Mm-hmm.
So you have that. So we're like 3 tiers, okay? So we've got normal plant milk, then Barista, and then creamer, would you say?
I suppose, yeah. I would think of a Barista milk as one that you would steam or froth for a latte or something. And then the creamer, you just put a touch of it in your coffee to sweeten it up.
Interesting. I think you're more like coffee connoisseurs over there, perhaps, than we are. That might be like the difference.
Sorry, I wouldn't know how to prep a cup of tea for my life, so.
Right, my most vegan thing. I got a book out the library for my little boy that I wanted to recommend. It's so cute. It's called What Clara Saw by Jessica. Oh God, I don't know how to say this. Jessica Meserve, I think, Meserve. It's about a little girl that goes on a day to the zoo and she is thinking about what makes animals different to humans. And it's things like, do animals feel joy? Do animals feel sad when their friends go away? And it is so nice. And
that sounds adorable.
It's not kind of a vegan book. It's not about farm animals, but it just has some ideas in it about, I guess, what makes animals different to humans.
Yeah.
So it felt very aligned to vegan thinking.
Oh, too cute.
I know.
And we want to hear your most and least vegan things. So if you have some, send them in to us at podcast@veganuary.com.
At Veganuary, we would love everyone that takes part to go 100% vegan, obviously. But I think we recognize that that's probably not going to happen. So although not everybody who takes part in Veganuary goes 100% vegan, we do survey people at the end of their month of trying vegan with us. And we find that usually, I'm kind of taking an approximate average of the last few surveys we've done, 75% to 85% say that they reduce their meat and dairy from their diet by at least half. So we kind of, in this episode, really wanting to embrace the flexitarian approach a little bit and say to people, it's fine if you decide that you don't want to be 100% vegan after doing Veganuary, but hopefully there's lots of things that you can take away from your Veganuary experience and kind of apply them to reducing meat and dairy from your diet, and also just being a bit more aware of where your food comes from. Yes.
Yeah, we talk a lot about ways to make it easier, and a lot of people tell us that it's easier than they even thought it would be to try vegan. But, we don't want to sugarcoat it either. Like, there are some things that are challenging when you're first getting started. So I'm curious, what are some common things you hear, Stu, that might prevent people from going fully vegan?
I've got a list, Wendy. I think living with non-vegan people is like quite a big challenge. If you have a partner who isn't vegan and you're sharing the same meals. We heard Deborah Meaden talk about this a little bit last week. That can be quite tricky. I think as well, if you've got kids and your kids are used to a certain, eating certain foods, it can be quite hard to transition them to vegan diets sometimes. So I think that's a big one. And sometimes it can just make you feel quite isolated if you're living in a household where you're the only person who's eating a plant-based diet. I think the availability of vegan foods and ingredients, we're quite spoiled, I think, in our countries that, vegan food and plant-based food is really widely available. And I live in a pretty big city. I think people in the UK who live in more rural locations struggle to sometimes find vegan food. And I don't know what the situation is there with general availability of food, but since things like the pandemic and the Ukraine war and Brexit here as well, just the general availability of all kinds of food is a bit funny. So often in the supermarket, the kind of things that I would normally just buy week in, week out, sometimes they just aren't there on the shelves. And I think when you're not plant-based, it's a bit easier to deal with that because there's often more different options of the same things that you can choose from. But sometimes when you're plant-based, it's just you've just got that one product, and if that one product's not there, well, you're just not having that for the week. So that's something.
Then you're blending up your own coffee creamer.
Blending up your own coffee creamer, indeed. Then I think another one is concerns about health and nutrition. So just making sure you're ticking all those boxes like B12 and omegas and iodine and all these things. Sometimes that can feel like a really big hurdle to overcome. And then like not finding certain substitutes for things that you just love. And the one that we hear most often is cheese. People seem to find it really hard to transition from normal dairy cheese to vegan cheese.
Yeah, and I gotta say, hang in there, because when I first went vegan, there was no good Parmesan cheese, and I was crushed because that was my favorite, and I really missed it. And now about 10 years later, there are so many good vegan Parmesans. So we'll get there. We'll catch up.
Indeed.
So, Stu, anyone who signs up for Veganuary is basically getting this great little love note from you every day with all of your best tips for going vegan. So you are the guy to answer this question. What are top tips for getting over some of these hurdles?
I like the phrase love note. It is very loving. It comes from a place of love. I think focus on the big wins. Like, do what you can. Focus on the big wins. If there are things that you're finding challenging, just maybe leave those till later. Kick the can down the road a little bit. So, if it is just cheese that you're really struggling with, well, go plant-based for everything else apart from cheese until you feel really confident to start stepping out and trying different cheeses and adding those to your diet. I think make sure you follow a kind of structured and supportive plan. So obviously I want to direct everyone to Veganuary and heading to the Veganuary website and signing up to receive my love notes. But of course, there's loads of other plans available. So, do some research and find one that works for you. But you want to make sure that you're understanding what your nutritional needs are, that you're getting lots of tips about what you can cook or what you can buy or which restaurants you can go to. And I think that's something that will really help people stick to a vegan diet or create habits of the things that they want to keep from those plans.
Yeah, fantastic tips.
And I think as well, that's going to help you feel like you're not alone. Like it's also look out for like groups you can join, maybe on Facebook or local community groups. There's lots of kind of vegan groups. Kind of in the UK, lots of cities have vegan groups, so you can make friends, not feel so isolated. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, find your people. Community is so important.
Okay, Wendy, it's time for us to introduce our interview guest for today's episode. Henry Dimbleby is the co-founder and former CEO of the chain restaurant Leon. He also co-founded the Sustainable Restaurant Association and co-authored the government commissioned School Food Plan. His independent national food strategy was published in 2021, which in turn led to the book Ravenous: How to Get Ourselves and Our Planet into Shape. And in preparation for this interview, Wendy, I have been plowing my way through this book and I would highly recommend it. I think if people have signed up to Veganuary and they really appreciate the kind of stuff they learn about the food system and about how we get our food that's in the Veganuary emails, they're going to find this book like really invaluable and really interesting. So let's have a listen to our interview with Henry. All right, Henry, it's lovely to have you here on the Veganuary podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. I know you say in the book Ravenous that you are still a meat eater, but I'd love to start by asking you, because this is what we ask all our guests, if you have a kind of favourite dream plant-based meal.
It's interesting you should ask that, because I have been trying to work out how to, since kind of discovering the impact that meat had on the planet, I've been trying to work out, as a meat eater and with 3 children, 15, 13 and 11, one of whom eats everything, one of whom is like a kind of Silicon Valley billionaire. He only eats meat and fruit. And the other is kind of veg curious, my daughter. And I've been trying to work out how we eat less meat on a regular basis. I love the food, like those, like Kerala vegetarian cuisine, those kind of things. But they're quite, if that's not what you do, it's quite a mindset shift. And the thing that has unlocked it for all of us is I now get a subscription, and this sounds a bit weird, but of really delicious beans delivered to our house every 2 weeks. But they're the ones in jars, butter beans, really good big queen chickpeas, black beans, and they're so delicious. And so now it can be anything, but they basically have become the kind of meat replacement in our household. Yeah. And everyone loves them, because basically what I've learned is you can't, it has to taste good. That you're never going to get people on the long term to eat for moral reasons if it doesn't taste really good. So that has been the thing that has unlocked us. And probably this kind of signature dish that we have quite a lot is a shakshuka. So but done with a black bean, but like kind of Israeli shakshuka dish, peppers and onions and garlic and black beans with eggs cracked on top, and I ferment my own chili. So just chilies, 2.5% salt by weight, whiz them up in a Magimix and leave them for 3 weeks, and you get a delicious fermented chili sauce, and that goes with it. So that's the answer.
Oh, I'm salivating. That sounds
I'm quite hungry now.
That does sound really good. So we would love if you could give us a brief history of how you came to publish the National Food Strategy in 21 and the book that followed.
Yes, so I was asked by the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in 2019 to produce an independent review on how we could create a food system that not only fed everyone nutritious food, but did so while restoring biodiversity, sequestering carbon. And this was at a time where there had been quite a lot of work in the UK done on biodiversity. We're quite forward in our farming thing, as well, on biodiversity and on carbon sequestration. But people were saying, hold on, you can't eat butterflies. That was like, what are we going to eat? So the idea was, can you do all of those things together? And that was the purpose of the review. And basically, if you were kind of to boil it right down, the answer to that question was, we created a food system that answered a very particular problem. In the 40s, people after the war, people looked forward over the next 50 years. The population of the planet was projected to go from about 2.8 billion to about 8 to 10 billion. And there wasn't going to be enough land to feed that population. We dug up all the land. And so we invented this new form of farming, known ironically as the Green Revolution, which is actually one of the most brilliantly ingenious things humankind has ever done. Without it, 30%, at least 30% of the people on the planet wouldn't be alive today without that form of farming and industrial fertilizer and all that stuff. But it has become, it now completely dominates the environment. So it's the biggest cause of biodiversity loss, by far, biggest cause of deforestation, water pollution, water shortage, collapse of aquatic life. After energy, it's the biggest cause of release of greenhouse gases, about 20 to 30% globally. And we can solve that, but one of the things that we need to do is we need to eat less meat. So, and funny enough, this isn't about methane, although that's important, direct greenhouse gases. It's about the sheer amount of land meat takes up. So the animals that we slaughter about 80 billion animals a year to feed us as a species. At any one time, those animals weigh twice as much as all of us and 20 times as much as all of the wild animals. And they take up 75% of farming land, either directly where they're grazing or the crops that are used to feed them. And we don't have any chance of creating a sustainable food system unless we reduce that meat intake by about 30%. And we published this. There was also a whole bunch. It's also a disaster for our health, by the way. It's going to completely break the NHS and impoverish us if we don't sort it out. And we published this in July 21. And my wife, who's a journalist, Jemima Lewis, who'd been working on it with me, just helping me kind of write it in plain English, said, look, no one sane is ever going to download a government strategy from a government website. Yeah. And the ideas in this thing are actually as important as the policies, maybe more important. We've got to turn it into a book. And that's where Ravenous came from, which is, I was like, right, yeah, we've got to turn it into a book. Are you up for doing that? And so she's my co-author, which is fantastic. And really, Ravenous is, we tried to write it for an intelligent kind of teen. Like our son, George, was who read it, actually. We were picked up. We didn't make him, didn't force him. He picked up and read it. But we wanted to make it like engaging and like gripping and like a great narrative yarn, and so that many people would read it. And actually, since it's happened, since we published it earlier this year, we've had just the most important thing for me is have people working in government in America, in France, in Germany, in Sweden, all get in touch and say, oh, this is really good. We're going to use it to inform how we think about things. So that was why we did it, and it looks like it worked.
I've just pretty much finished reading it myself, and I think you've achieved all those things. It's very readable, and a lot of complex issues. You simplify really well to the kind of Joe Blogs reader like me. You've kind of just touched on the Green Revolution and how important that is to the way we produce food now. Are there things that the food system is doing really well right now? Because we're going to come on to talk about a lot of the negatives, but what is the food system doing well at the moment?
I mean, it is. So I was on I was the lead non-executive director at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs for 5 years, ending in March of 2023. And during COVID, you saw the food system at its absolute best. So we said, I texted my permanent secretary, the person who runs the department, in early March 2020, or maybe it was late February. And I said, look, do we know that we're going to be able to feed everyone if we go into lockdown? Like, do we actually know that we can get the food to the right places? And she was like, I'm not sure we do, actually. And so we set up this group called FRIF, the Food Resilience Industry Forum. Basically, we suspended competition law, and every morning through those early days of lockdown, everyone would meet on a conference call and say, right, what are we going to do? How do we get the food to where it needs to be? And this was a big issue. So you'd had 25% of calories had been taken out of production altogether because we used to eat 25% of our calories out of home, and we now had to eat them in home. And so there were all these kind of huge bags of flour that couldn't get in, all these kind of catering-sized foodstuffs that we couldn't get into the supply chain. And then people had moved the way they shopped. So they no longer went to big supermarkets in those early days of lockdown because they didn't want to go where there were crowds. Everyone was buying food from their corner shops. And the kind of we saw in that meeting the kind of gears of the food system move to, with a few exceptions, when there were panic buying, which caused, you remember the loo roll. Loo roll, flour was the other one, because everyone used to buy their cakes in shops. Yeah. And then suddenly they all took up home baking. So like trying to work out where to get the bags from, small bags, to get the flour from the big bags into small bags. But other than those small things, all the way through COVID, we had an a variety of freshness of food that would be unrecognizable to our grandparents. And we kind of take that for granted. In the food strategy, we talked about, like, what does food security mean? And we argued it means, not having riots. At some stage, if food is not available or is too expensive, you have the breakdown of society. And we are so far, you could buy an avocado in my local corner shop in Hackney on Christmas Day. Now, whatever you say about the kind of bad things about that is pretty amazing. And if you look at our grandparents' generation, they saw what was available to us. That would be pretty amazing. So I think that the fact that, famine, there hasn't been a famine this century that wasn't in a country where there was either political corruption or actual warfare. We have got very good at a species at growing enough food to feed us and distributing that, packaging that and distributing it to where it is needed. And that is not that, and that is all the green. That was also Norman Borlaug, who was this amazing American botanist who started the Green Revolution. He went to Mexico during the war. He'd grown up in Idaho during the Great Depression. He'd seen food riots and starvation. He went to Mexico in the middle 40s, and he was sent there by the Rockefeller Foundation. And he said that the quality of the soil, the life these people are living, they're barely getting by. I need to do something. He told his wife it had clubbed his mind. And he created the Green Revolution. The job of the Green Revolution was to, in his mind, get new breeds of crops, feed them with nitrogen fertilizer, and create more calories per square meter of soil than we had before. And on that, if you measure it by that, it has been an astounding success. We now create twice as many calories for 8 billion people from less land than we did for 2.8 billion people after the war. And so I think that, yes, when you solve one problem, you tend to create others, but that isn't something to be sniffed at the Green Revolution in terms of, the good things about the food system.
Definitely. And yeah, I think that's a good transition, because we've talked a bit about meeting basic needs, right? And the problem of making sure that people are getting enough calories, but we've also touched on earlier on some of the health implications. And so, the matter of what people are eating. And we know that diet-related disease is by far the biggest cause of avoidable illness and death in the developed world. So how does our food system make us so unhealthy?
Well, I think that it's a really good question. I would say why? Why does our... So there are two reasons, and I'll be quizzing Stuart later on, because see if he's got that fine book. But basically, by the way, the book's quite gloomy in parts 1 and 2, and I had people texting me going, "Henry, this is so depressing." Like part 3 is full of optimism. So if you're not there yet, hang on in there, because it does get better. But so there were basically the reason that it's so environmentally destructive is obvious, and that's quite a good thing. And there was a British economist, Partha Dasgupta, who called it the invisibility of nature. So he pointed out that nature is not visible in any of the systems, or most of the systems that we use to measure human success. You can't count it in your wallet. It's not in the balance sheet of companies. It's not in the way we measure GDP. And in fact, he points out it's worse than that. So he estimates that we spend globally about $500 billion a year in government subsidies towards activities that destroy nature, largely industrial farming, fishing, and fossil fuel companies. And so he points out we're giving nature a negative cost. We're paying companies to destroy nature. We shouldn't be surprised that we're destroying it. When it comes to health, it's something slightly different. We called it the junk food cycle. And basically, our appetite is an extraordinary thing. And the first part of the book just goes, part of that is kind of trying to explain to people how the things our appetite will make us do. It is the most extraordinary evolved system. The hypothalamus, which is the seat of where the hormones that create appetite go, is one of the most ancient bits of evolution. It exists in marine worms, so it had developed at that stage, fundamental to the desires of any organism. And basically, our appetite evolved at a time when calories were scarce. Mm-hmm. And so it gives us enormous pleasure eating foods that are full of sugar and fat and salt, incidentally. And because we should be programmed to spend the extra energy chasing the antelope, climbing up for the beehive, because the honey gives us great pleasure. And when that food has certain qualities that are particularly found in processed foods today, which are they're calorie dense, soft, and low in insoluble fiber, they actually fill us up less quickly. They don't fire our satiety hormones. And that has been spotted by food companies, not because they are evil people wanting to kill our children, but simply because it is easier to sell that kind of food than it is other foods. And they have spent more and more money marketing, developing those products. We've eaten more, they spend more money. We've eaten more, they spend more money, and we get sick. To give you a sense of the scale of this problem, in the UK, 57% of the food that we eat is ultra processed. 85% of those foods are deemed by the World Health Organization to be too unhealthy to market to children. So this junk food cycle, it is, and when you talk to the food company bosses now behind the scenes, they realize this. They're like, well, what can we do? But it is a weird but undisputable fact that it is easier to market that stuff. There are in the UK, you can buy Kit Kats alone in 29 different formats. It used to be 28, and then they launched Kit Kat breakfast cereal, which is what the world needs. So that's 29. It's just easier to market than kale. It's an easier sell, and that is why we're all getting sick.
Yeah. I love in the book how the detail you go into in this, and I learned some really interesting things that, I suppose, destroyed some myths that the exercise is no good for losing weight was a really interesting one.
So for anyone listening to this, if you are the things that I say to people are like, what should I do? First, you say, exercise is the most powerful medicine, probably even more powerful than food. Exercising is just unbelievably good for you. Partially because, for reasons we're not quite clear on, but the body uses exercise as a trigger to clean itself. So exercising, absolutely brilliant. Your body fights against losing weight viciously. It makes you hungrier. It stops burning calories for reproduction, for your immune system. And so we tell everyone that they should exercise to lose weight, and they go to the gym and they exercise like mad. They don't lose weight, and then they give up the one thing that they should be doing for their health. And also you should realize that your weight, there's a huge genetic element for each of us. So some of us have a body that will fight to keep us at a BMI, to keep us overweight. Others will have a body that will fight to keep the normal weight. One of the reasons that we think that the South Sea Islanders have such a high prevalence of obesity is because the genes, those people, their ancestors, survived an ocean crossing of several thousand miles. And the ones who survived were the ones who had high body mass when they set out, who had those genes. So don't exercise to lose weight, exercise for health. And then when you're eating, eat for health and for hunger. So don't calorie count, but eat loads of veg, loads of food that is high in roughage, insoluble fibers, really important. Not dense calories, beans, vegetables, all that good stuff. If you do that, those two things, you probably will lose a bit of weight. If you, particularly with the other one, eating for hunger. But even if you don't, statistically, you will be as healthy, if not healthier, than someone who doesn't do either of those things and is of so-called normal weight. So that kind of focusing on the inputs and on pleasure and health and mental health and enjoyment of exercise rather than focusing on kilograms or pounds and stones, that would be my kind of single take-home message for the individual. I think there's a lot the state needs to do to improve the system as well.
So you've neatly summarized the kind of health aspects that you talk about in the book. Can you neatly summarize the environmental aspects? So, what are the biggest environmental impacts that the food system is having? Yeah,
so I look at the environmental thing as a bit like a simultaneous equation. So it is definitely the case that, as I said, the two biggest ones, so let's set aside water quality, water pollution. The two biggest issues, biodiversity collapse. Since 1970, 69% of the population of wild animals have collapsed. And that is equivalent to give you a sense of scale, if that was humans, that is like wiping out the population of North and South America, China, Africa, and Oceania since 1970. So it is just unimaginable destruction. And over 80% of that happened on farmland. It happened on farms. So that is kind of the one harm. The other is the carbon, which is that 20 to 30% of our food, of our carbon footprint is from our food. So the question then is, given that land is finite, is it possible to produce enough food, farm for biodiversity, and sequester carbon? And the first answer is you have to think about, so a lot of people then say, well, it's either about land sparing or land sharing. What do I mean about that? Some people say we need to double down on Borlaug. We need to double down on the Green Revolution. We need to have even more intensification. And that will let us free up land to return to wilderness. Mm-hmm. Other people say, no. That's not right. We need land sharing. We need more organic farms. We need animals, wild animals, and farm to live together in harmony in these kind of complex ecosystems on farms. And that's the way to restore biodiversity. And actually, the argument is neither of those, because the way these systems have evolved is we have lots of wildlife that has now evolved to live on farms. We've been farming since the Holocene, 10,000 BC, this period of stable climate that allowed us to farm, allowed us to produce a surplus, allowed us to create civilization. So there's a large amount of wildlife that lives well on farms, but you also have wildlife. You want to free up some land. We reckon about 5 to 8% in the UK from farming completely. So you actually need to have more of a continuum. You need to have some of that very highly concentrated calorie production with lower inputs, some of the kind of sharing, and then wild land. And the good news is that about 20% of the farmland that we farm today only produces about 3% of our calories. So we farm a lot of very marginal land. And that means you have the opportunity to take some out of production and not starve everyone. Mm-hmm. And so there is to that kind of equation, calories, nutrition, plus biodiversity, plus carbon sequestration. Can you solve it? You can solve it, but only if you reduce waste. Only if you reduce waste. And we looked at waste in three forms: the kind of stuff we normally talk about, which is, you know, stuff you throw away, food you throw away that you could eat.
Soggy
There's
cucumber in the fridge.
there's waste in terms of farming badly. So there's quite a lot. You could actually be more efficient in the way you farmed, and a lot of the most environmentally destructive farming is actually also low yielding farming. And then finally, there's wasting land by producing crops to feed to animals, or allowing animals to graze over huge areas, creating biodiverse deserts. And actually, that third one, reducing meat consumption by 30%, was significantly bigger than the other two. So, kind of in a nutshell, the argument on land use is we need to ask more from our land if we're not going to have fossil fuels. We don't have this millions of years of trapped sunlight that we can call on, and therefore we need to farm a bit differently, and that means reducing the wasteful ways in which we use our land.
Now, let's say we just stay the course. We just keep doing what we're doing. I mean, what are some of the effects we could see over the next 50 years if the food system doesn't change?
Well, so the food system is unsustainable, literally unsustainable. So that means that it cannot continue to go in this mode of operation. And so the question then is, if we don't intervene, if we don't do anything about it, how does it move into the next, what mode of operation does it move into? And on health, what that looks like is we get, by 2035, the NHS thinks it's going to spend as much treating type 2 diabetes as it does on all cancers today. And that's just one condition of bad diet. It is the bad diet is the leading reason why 2.5 million people are out of work today, because they've got hypertension, type 2 diabetes, musculoskeletal problems. So what does that look like if that goes forward? It looks like the NHS sucking in money from the rest of the state, because we can't let our beloved NHS go down, and it's just going to get more and more expensive. And then at the same time, we are increasingly sick, unproductive, out of work, so we have lower tax receipts. So we become both the sick and impoverished nation. That gets quite bad. And that's not just us, it's the same in Canada, same in America. On the environmental side, the food system is effectively imperiling, the way we eat is imperiling the way we eat. So biodiversity is critical to the proper function of farming, and climate change is huge. Will have a huge impact on yields. And if you look at yields, like what do we think will happen in a 1.5, 2 degree climate change scenario? You see something quite interesting, which is you see that the northern hemisphere is likely, it may not happen, there may be floods, there may be too many heat waves, but we think on balance, wheat in the northern hemisphere is likely to get more productive. It likes warm weather, it likes water, it likes carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But then if you look at the equatorial and southern zones, rice and maize yields are likely to fall significantly. And that might be slowly, or it might be in some cases quite rapidly or catastrophically. So for example, the Mekong Delta, in a 1 meter sea level rise scenario, it's the biggest rice exporter to the world. Half of it would be underwater. So you could have a kind of catastrophic flood that wipes out your production. So what does that look like? On the health side, it's kind of slow and chronic decline. And on the food production side, there's a chart that NASA have done that shows those yields that I've just talked about. It's green in the northern hemisphere, and it's kind of yellow and red in the equatorial zones in the southern hemisphere. And that's back to the problems of 1945. That looks like wars over resources, mass migration. That looks pretty unpleasant.
And presumably things like
and in the end, if you do nothing, population adjustment, right? You know, in the end, people will starve.
And presumably before we got to that point, higher food costs, less availability of the kind of foods we're used to, like possibly not being able to get the avocado on Christmas Day, like you described at the top of that.
I think it's kind of, so funny enough, the avocado on Christmas Day, although it is, it's a kind of image either of, you know, what, you know, compared with eating, you know, turnips and gruel for half the year. It's kind of how far we've come, or to some, it might be a kind of outrageous display of our ability to consume, regardless of the consequences. I actually think it's a bit of a red herring, even though I brought it up. So I think that you can see a regenerative food system. You can imagine one that is health giving and has lots of fresh food. You know, we'll be able to get food during the summer from Morocco, particularly if we decarbonize transport. We'll be able to get it from Morocco to us, so we can eat veg during the winter. We tend in this country to have a slightly weird view about food security. We happen to be an island that happens to be able to feed itself, still could. If we were surrounded by U-boats again, within about a year and a half, 2 years, we could feed ourselves in the UK. And that gives us quite a weird idea about food security. If you look at, say, Egypt, where half of their wheat comes from Ukraine, you know, there is no way that you could farm Egypt to produce enough food for its current population with current technologies, even like in the next 15, 20 years. And we're never going to, I hope, move the you know, half the population of Egypt to Ukraine. That's not going to happen. We're not. But we are successful as a species because we take the productive parts of the planet and move the food from it to the less productive parts of the planet. We just need to do that in a less destructive way. So I think that what you know, probably, you know, unless they decarbonize jet fuel, which doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, the really egregious stuff, which are the jetted in foods from aboard, will go. But you'll still have, you know, electric trucks coming in from sunny weather in Spain and Morocco, you know, electric ferries taking them across the channel, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it might not look, it could be much, much better without looking that much different.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to like Veganuary's pet subject, so plant-based eating. So to what degree do you think that more people adopting plant-based or flexitarian diets is going to be part of the solution?
It is essential. So it is both essential to, and it is the one thing that we thought government couldn't do anything about. So if you look at, or at least would be very difficult, if you look at, we did focus groups, quantitative research from people from all demographics about where they wanted government to get involved, what kind of government, what kind of government intervention in the food system they would be happy with. People were actually really happy on health intervention when we don't really care that much about the nanny state. People are fed up with their kids having crap food advertised to them. They want intervention. You talked about meat, and like within a few minutes, all hell would break loose in the focus groups. Like there is, for some people, the eating of meat is very central to their identity.
Yeah.
In kind of weirdly deep ways. And the idea that the government should get involved in doing anything that should stop eating meat is difficult. And therefore, it is one area where I think we need, as consumers, to make the difference. And I think the key is here, how do you make it unthreatening to people who barbecue? I love to barbecue. I know that makes me a bad person, but there it is. How do you make it unthreatening to eat more veg? And that then becomes all about, and I've noticed that Veganuary is doing more of this. It's like, how do you make it easier for people to do that? The focus groups that we have, when you said, would you like to eat less meat? Everyone's like, yeah. Everyone's trying to eat less meat. They just don't want to be told by the government to do it. But then the problem they have is that it's actually a huge, so in this country and amongst, not in Southern American culture, but amongst the kind of Caucasians and I'd argue a lot of the African Americans, not all the African American cuisines, but a lot of them, meat is central to the dish. So you'd start by thinking about what's the meat, and then you put stuff around it. And it is a non-trivial thing to go from that to cooking veg. Like we reckon 2 days a week, you shouldn't be eating meat if you eat them all days a week now. So reduce by 2. That is actually not an easy thing. And I think there are two things that we need to get us through that. One is, it's actually why, amidst all the debate about ultra processed food and meat substitute products, it's why I'm actually a big fan of meat substitute products. I don't eat them myself. I eat beans. I was a chef, so I'm quite lucky. But I think that they solve that problem.
Yeah.
And the fact that everyone eats the foods they replace are processed anyway. So why not use that fact that people eat a processed burger to have a burger that's better for the planet? So I think that is part of it. But the other part of it is kind of longer term education. I mean, you guys, you're both vegan.
Yeah.
How long did it take you maybe you've been vegan since birth, but how long did it take you for it to be as easy for you to cook vegan as it was to cook with meat? Just as simple as easy?
Well, for me, quite quick, really. So when I went vegan, I was an omnivore before, but I'd been in a relationship with a vegetarian, and I was in a relationship then with a vegan. So I'd had a lot of years of practicing eating and cooking, plant-based, vegetarian.
How about you, Wendy?
So I've been vegan for about 13 years now. So it's pretty...
So since about 5, by the looks of things.
No, I was in college when I did it, but I was working at a restaurant, and I remember feeling like I was just taking away, right? I would make myself a sandwich, and I would just remove the meat and remove the cheese, and then I was left with bread and pesto or something. So at first it felt like this huge gap in my diet. And it did take me some time to figure out not only what goes in there instead of the meat, but how can I reimagine what a sandwich looks like for me and make it something, different and more nutritious. So yeah, I would say it took a couple of years to really adjust.
And how do you guys cook? How can you describe the kind of philosophy behind the food you cook at home? Do you have a way of cooking?
I like to cook from scratch, cook vegetables, cook whole foods, but I not in the last 5 years became a dad, and that has had a big impact on the way I cook. So there are a lot more processed foods in my diet now, because it's the kind of things like the sausages, chicken nuggets are the kind of things that are easy to get, calories into him. So that's changed quite a lot. And something you touch on in the book is about, if you're someone who knows how to cook, that makes the transition much easier, I think. So I think that's something that I've really benefited from, because I do know how to cook. Yeah.
How about you, Wendy?
I'm very seasonal. I really, I love to cook, and I love to go to the farmer's market and just see what's in season right now, what looks great, and kind of build my menu around that. And I'm with you. I love beans. I eat a ton of beans, a ton of tofu.
Is this because my vegetarian food, when I cook vegetarian, I would say it is 80% or 90% stew, curries based. So that is the change, which is the central thing has become something that is a bit more liquid. And I'm just trying to think, it's rarely, maybe, it's not vegan, but maybe I occasionally might cook something with the kids with halloumi in it, but normally that is the transition. It's away from one. I don't cook pies much. I never do vegetables that look like meat. I don't really do nut cutlets.
Me and my partner talk all the time about how we never use the knives in our drawer. Because everything is a stew or a curry, we eat everything just with a fork.
Yeah.
So true.
I think a natural next one to go to, maybe stew, is around developing new vegan menu options. So you're the co-founder of Leon. How do you go about that? Yeah,
so interestingly, that was, we sold Leon in 2021, but we started with we opened years ago, 2004. We opened our first restaurant, and I can't remember the exact figures, but probably 70% of our dishes had meat in them. We had a lot of grilled chicken and a lot of meatballs. And by the time we sold, it was probably 70-80% vegan. We had halloumi. We had very little vegetarian because we were like, why bother? Like, why not just do something that's vegan if you're going to give that option? But what was interesting about it was that happened there was some big change of it kind of happened by osmosis. Like, we wanted to have a bit more vegetarian thing. We reckoned we could give more value. Like, this meat's so expensive. So, one of my favorite dishes on a menu, which we had from really early on, was a kind of slightly Brazilian inspired black bean stew. And the portion you could give was bigger for the price. The flavor was bigger than a meatball. It was like, so there was a kind of value thing going on. And then we had increasing numbers of vegetarian, vegan dishes. We'd often put in nuts into things to give into the kind of curries and things to give protein. Although I think we then moved away from it when all the nut allergy stuff got a bit out of control. But then John, my business partner, when we started Leon, it had always been the thing we talked about it internally. We talked about it as like McDonald's in heaven. If you went to McDonald's, but it was in heaven, what would it look? If you just had an art class with Michelangelo, and then you were going to a fast food restaurant, what would it be like? And he was always like, "You've got to have a burger. You've got to have a burger in McDonald's." And I was like, "But there is no burger that is like tastes good, does you good." And he developed quite a delicious, it's called the Love Burger, a vegan burger, which is really quite tasty. And then off the back of that, we hadn't, like, up until that stage, we hadn't done things that were meat shaped at all. And then the other thing we did, which was a massive hit, again, because it was really tasty and cheaper, was the meatless meatball. Because it turns out, if you think about a meatball, and particularly a Moroccan meatball, most of the flavor in that is cumin, coriander, tomato, garlic, ras al hanout, and you could easily get the taste of it from a bean. So why on earth are we kind of killing a sentient animal at great cost in order to make that? So they then became quite successful. So, but I think we got to that. It was almost by accident. We never said, look, we need to be 70% vegetarian, vegan. It just kind of evolved like that as our taste changed, as people bought that stuff, kind of emerged. I mean, one of the things that people don't understand about just menu generation in general in fast food restaurants is the unbelievable complexity of the journey to get from what you originally wanted to what you sell. So you create like dishes that you think are delicious, and then you cost them up and realize you'd have to sell them for £20 because of rents in London and things. And so you go through this extraordinary iterative process where we used to call it spreadsheet cooking, where you look at the cost in pence of anything in the recipe, and you say, well, hold on, the fresh coriander in that is 10p. That's like twice what the tomato. It's not doing that much work. How can we do it? And one of the things that stood out was the meat, because the meat was like always such a huge part of the cost. And you were just thinking, that doesn't add enough pleasure to be worth charging that much for. That was another way in which meat gradually used to come out, just because of the cost of the stuff.
It's so interesting what you've just said about menu generation, because it made me think of something that really stood out to me in the book, which is this idea of having to balance all these things that we care about, having to balance the environmental impacts, the animal welfare, food sustainability, food security, all these things. So that almost sounds like what you've just described in menu generation, almost sounds like a kind of template for the thinking behind the food strategy.
Yeah, I mean, we always used to say that what we were trying to do was do tasty food that was healthy, quick, and inexpensive. When we started, incidentally, in 2004, sustainability wasn't on our agenda. We just became obsessed by it because we began to see like what actually happened. It was like going behind the curtain. But those four things, and we always say, doing tasty foods easy, doing tasty and healthy foods, fine. Tasty and healthy food fast begins to get quite difficult, and then tasty and healthy food fast and not too expensive became really hard. But then the environmental thing was kind of, we began to see it just from talking to our suppliers, beginning to run. People thought we were organic. People thought we were perfect in all sorts of ways, and we weren't. So we were forced to look into it. And really, that, funny enough, the reason I think I was asked to do the food strategy was because I'd begun to talk about this. And it reminded me of after my wife had our first son, George. She had a kind of completely medieval labor. It went on for 2 days, and it was started at home and then went into hospital, and it was just an absolute nightmare. And after she came out, I had to break her out of hospital because they weren't feeding her anything. They were like giving her white bread. So I said that I'm taking her home, and I had to sign her out saying, I'll take the risk. And we went out into the park near us, and she said she was looking around at all. It was a lovely spring day, warm spring day, and families were running around, and people were walking their dogs and chatting at the local, the Hackney Little Ladies football team that was going on. And mine was like, how can these people all just be behaving as if nothing happens? Don't they know what happens to women when they give birth? How can this go on? Why is no one talking about it? And that was kind of a bit like when we began to look at the food system, it was a bit like that. I felt like the mad person kind of wanting to go up to people in the park and shake them and say, you just like, why is no one talking about this? This system is like the biggest contributor to ill health and the destruction of the planet. And yet we're all just wandering about, walking our dogs and playing football. This is insane.
We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. I don't feel like we touched on any of the optimistic parts that you promised us. And I just wanted to make sure we covered off like what things did you recommend in the food strategy report? What is there to be optimistic about?
On the health side, I'm more optimistic on the environment side, so I'll end with that. On the health side, I think we go one of two ways. I think the likelihood is, if I had to bet on it, that we will, the junk food cycle, this interaction between appetite and commercial incentives, will be broken not by regulating business, but by hacking our ancient biology. So you will have heard probably of Wegovy, Ozempic. They're two brand names from a drug called semaglutide that suppresses your appetite. There are loads of drugs coming down the line. That's the Prozac of these kind of drugs. It's the first. There will be loads in the market in 5 years' time. And I think you could find that 30% of the population are permanently on appetite-suppressing drugs, which is problematic for all sorts of reasons, which we go into the book. We don't have time to talk about here. Absolutely. I do think, and I'm going to get into the optimistic stuff, the optimistic stuff on health, I do think there is a chance that we will look back in 30 years' time at this time and think, hell, those were the days. Am I allowed to swear on your podcast?
Yeah.
Sure.
If not, we'll cut it out later.
Those are the days when we ate that. That was weird.
Yeah.
And I was talking to a group of students at a school near here the other day, and I was like, change can happen. When I was young, we could smoke on the bus. We could smoke on the airplane. You could smoke on the tube, for God's sake. And in the book, we talk about actually how cultures that we look on as good food cultures, like the Japanese, which you think were kind of just descended perfectly formed, are completely created by the state, and that states can actually create better cultures. So that's what I hope for on the health side. On the environment side, because we spend so much money paying people to destroy the environment, there is a very clear path there, which is you stop doing that and then you start paying for public goods. And we are, in this country, we are world leading in trying to make that happen. It's happening in fits and starts. We've basically said we're going to take the £3.4 billion that we used to spend to pay people to make food, to restore the environment, sequester carbon, restore biodiversity. And I think I think it is very likely that we will have a future where we do create a food system which produces enough food, which is full of nature, full of life, where the borders around the water courses and the farms are slightly rougher, where the hedges are slightly raggeder, but where we do manage to produce really delicious, nutritious food while restoring our planet. And I think that is something like you can already go and see farms here and in America doing. And I think that will be the future on the environmental side.
Great. That seems like a great note to end on. We do always ask everyone a question at the end, which is to nominate their favourite vegetable. We have a Vote for Veggies campaign this year in Veganuary, but I feel like, given what you told us at the top of the podcast, maybe we should ask you to nominate your favourite bean.
I think that question is magnificent in its complete absurdity. The idea of voting for your favourite vegetable, completely ridiculous. Although, would it be alliums? I don't know. My favourite bean. I have just started in my subscription of beans. They've just started doing a thing called the Carlin pea, which is a heritage bean, and it's absolutely delicious. It tastes it looks a bit like a chickpea, but slightly brown and slightly smaller. And it tastes a bit like a pea. And I did a thing the other day of like a braised. So I braised some lettuce and onions and garlic in a vegetable, and then put a bit of vegetable stock in, and then added peas and Carlin peas with a bit of lemon juice and some olive oil. And it was unbelievably delicious. So I'm campaigning. I think I know it's going to vain. Unlikely that the Carlin pea is going to win your poll this year. But in 20 years' time, when Carlin peas top the polls, I can say you heard it here first.
Taking credit. All right, lovely. Well, thanks for your time today, Henry. It was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you. Right, we're going to eat some food, aren't we? You suggested that I make something called grits, which I have heard people talk about on like films and TV, but I didn't really know what it was. And it's corn meal thrown into some stock, and then it like thickens up.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
It smells very, very savoury. Like quite. I put some nutritional yeast in. I followed the recipe. Told me to put nutritional yeast in. It's quite feety. I topped it with some spring onions. I felt like that might work quite nicely. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, so I'm not a Southern girl. I'm from New York, so I didn't grow up with grits, but I live in Virginia now, and I've been eating them more. So I'm curious to see what you think.
That's actually really nice.
They're nice,
really,
right?
Really nice, yeah. That's the kind of food that I like. It's very, very savoury.
Yeah, a little hot sauce on top for me is the ticket.
We have something in the UK which is interestingly quite a northern dish. It's funny that this is a southern dish, called peas pudding, which I think is made from split peas or lentils or something. I can't remember, but it reminds me of peas pudding quite a lot.
Interesting.
Lovely. Well, I made a big vat of this, so I've got lots of it at home. So I'm glad that I like it. What do you have?
Yeah, speaking of peas, I am trying some mushy peas today. And I have had mushy peas before.
They didn't look good when you held them up there, I have to say. They look a bit grey.
They're canned mushy peas.
Right.
So I didn't have time to go from scratch. Yeah. I am eating the Bachelors, which I now see it says Irish on the can. So sorry, inauthentic.
Interesting.
So I've had mushy peas before when I was in London on a plate of vegan fish and chips. Yeah. And I remember thinking, Who had the thought we should add some freshness and some brightness to this plate of fried food? Why don't we boil peas as long as possible? But I did like them. So let's see how the canned version holds up. Honestly, they're not terrible, right? It's
Okay.
a little bit.
That's good.
It's a little bit baby foody to me as an American. We don't eat a lot of peas in this format.
No.
But they taste like peas, and what's not to love? Like,
They're sort of, in the UK, I would say they're quite a sort of working class northern thing. They're much more, I think of them as being much more popular in the north than the south of the UK. And as you say,
yeah, I mean, I'm going to take another bite.
very popular at fish and chip shops. I like having them with a bit of mint sauce. A bit of mint on there is really good.
That would brighten them up. I like that idea.
Yeah. Right. To the bag of vegetables. Are you ready? We'll continue our vegetable league. We'll do a vegetable versus vegetable and decide what our favourites are. Already on the league boards, we have broccoli and parsnip. So it's a courgette.
Ooh,
A zucchini.
yes, a zucchini.
Zucchini. Zucchini, not zucchini.
Zucchini.
One thing I'm just thinking is a lot of vegetables are very suggestive shape.
Yeah, you've made some Freudian choices in this vegetable selection, Stuart.
Anyway, I have to say, courgette, not a very big fan myself. It's one of those things that I feel like I should like. So I do cook it quite relatively often, but it doesn't, if I saw it on a menu, it wouldn't get me very excited.
You know, I don't know if it's something that a lot of home gardeners grow in the UK, but in the US, it definitely is.
No, it is.
And it's a little bit of a joke about it because it grows so prolifically, and one zucchini plant produces tons and tons of vegetables. So people just don't know what to do with them, and they all come at once. So every family has like their how to get rid of the zucchini recipes. So in mine, it's zucchini bread, which is like a banana bread with zucchini.
Yeah.
And then there's a zucchini casserole my mom makes that has typically sausage and I don't remember what else. But I've made a vegan version and it's been delightful.
There we go. Okay. So that's courgette / zucchini / zucchini. And I've got the oven glove on just in case anyone's worried to make sure I don't.
No cheating.
Can't tell the shape. Yeah.
All right. Zucchini versus
Turnip.
Ooh.
Oh, this is a tough one. I can't get very excited about a turnip either. Do you know, I do love Burns Night. I don't know if you ever celebrate Burns Night in the US.
No.
So as in Rabbie Burns, the Scottish poet. So it's at the end of January, a sort of celebration of Scottishness. So people have Burns Night parties where they might do like Scottish traditional dancing and drink Scottish whiskey and sing Scottish songs and wear kilts and read Scottish poetry. And then you sit down for a meal of haggis, neeps and tatties. So I think neeps are turnips. So that's what it makes me think of. And I do like haggis. So haggis, not vegan. Definitely not vegan. It's like so far away from being vegan. But you can make a very good vegan version because it's lots of oats. And then you add stock and pepper. And then you might have neeps on the side. I have a feeling someone's going to write in and tell me that neeps are not turnips. But I'm saying that's what it makes me think of.
Yeah, I haven't really eaten many turnips. The only way I know I have them somewhat regularly is when I get falafel. They serve pickled turnips on falafel. So that's really my only neep experience.
Okay, cool. So what are we going for, courgette or turnip?
Yeah, zucchini or neeps. I'm going to say courgette.
I think I'm going to go for courgette either. But I mean, neither of these is getting me very excited, but I'm saying courgette. Yeah, So courgette goes up on the leaderboard next to broccoli and parsnip. And that means that it's the end of the podcast. So this podcast was recorded at Distorted Podcast Studios and produced by Jim Moore at Bloody Vegan Productions. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and do rate us 5 stars, ideally. If you want to contact us, you can email us at podcast@veganuary.com, and you'll find Veganuary at all the usual social media sites.
And be sure to sign up to take part in Veganuary by visiting veganuary.com to receive 31 daily emails filled with hints, tips, and recipes, all of which are put together to help introduce you to a vegan diet. It doesn't have to be January. You can sign up any time of the year.
Yes. All right. Thanks for listening. Bye.
1, 2,